In 1945, Britain had just won the Second World War. It was one of the three most powerful nations on Earth. Its empire covered a quarter of the globe, more than 400 million people across 6 continents. 30 years later, almost all of it was gone. Britain had not been invaded. It had not been defeated. It had sent people home. The question is why? The British Empire was, at its core, a trading system enforced by a navy. British factories produced manufactured goods. The empire supplied the raw materials: Indian cotton, South African gold, Australian wool, Malaysian rubber. The navy protected the shipping lanes. The City of London provided the finance. At its peak in 1913, Britain accounted for roughly 25% of global trade. The empire was not charity. It was a machine, and at its peak it was the most profitable machine in human history, controlling trade routes that handled 1 in every 4 of all global commerce. The fuel the machine ran on was control. Britain controlled the sea lanes through which global trade moved. It controlled the financial systems through which global investment flowed. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, what the dollar is today. To trade internationally in 1900 was, in most of the world, to trade in British pounds, through British banks, on British ships, insured at Lloyd's of London. The empire was not just territory, it was the infrastructure of the global economy. In August 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, it did so on behalf of the entire empire. Indian soldiers fought in France and Mesopotamia. Australian and New Zealand troops died at Gallipoli. Canadian troops held the line at Ypres. South African forces invaded German colonies in Africa. By the end of the war, over 1 million soldiers from the empire had died fighting in a European conflict they had not started. To fund the war, Britain borrowed from the United States on a scale that had no precedent. By 1918, Britain owed America approximately $4 billion, equivalent to roughly 140% of British GDP. The pound sterling, which had been the global reserve currency for a century, was now dependent on American goodwill to maintain its value. Britain had won the war. But the debt from WWI alone took decades to settle. The final payment to America would not come until 1933, 14 years after the armistice. A pattern was beginning. In 1942, with Japan advancing through Southeast Asia and Britain's position in India under threat, Churchill's government made a promise: India would receive full independence after the war. It was a pragmatic calculation. India's manpower, resources, and strategic position were essential to Britain's survival. The promise was made. 2.5 million Indians served in the British forces in World War, the largest volunteer army in history. America's Lend-Lease program supplied Britain with $31 billion worth of war material. The price was not just money. The American terms required Britain to dismantle the imperial preference system, the trade arrangements that gave empire goods preferential access to British markets. This was not incidental. The United States had been trying to open British imperial markets since the 1930s. The crisis of war gave them the leverage to demand it. Britain signed. It had no choice. The victory of 1945 was real. The invoice was also real. Here is what that invoice looked like. By the time VE Day celebrations ended, Britain owed America more than it earned in an entire year. The pound had lost its status as the world's reserve currency. The trade system that gave empire goods their advantage had been signed away. The war had been won. The empire had been mortgaged to pay for it. In July 1956, Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the waterway through which a quarter of Britain's trade passed. Britain, France, and Israel responded with a military operation. British and French paratroopers landed in Egypt. The operation was, militarily, a success. They took the canal. Then the United States told him to stop. President Eisenhower threatened to dump British government bonds on the open market, a move that would have caused a run on sterling and collapsed the British economy within days. Britain withdrew. Within a week of military victory, Britain was in full retreat, not because it had lost, because the country that held its debt had told it to leave. After Suez, the British government faced a question it could no longer avoid. What is the empire actually for? The trade advantages had been dismantled by Lend-Lease. The financial infrastructure had been replaced by the dollar. The military costs of garrisoning territories across 6 continents ran to hundreds of millions of pounds a year. And the political cost, anti-colonial movements were now finding support at the United Nations, with the United States making clear it would not back European colonialism, was rising every year, so Britain left. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960. In that single year of 1960, 17 African nations became independent, not because Britain was forced out, but because the Foreign Office had calculated that each territory cost more to administer than it returned. East Africa followed. The Caribbean, the Pacific. Each one a line item on a balance sheet that no longer added up. It was the most deliberate dissolution of power in modern history. An empire of 400 million people closed down like a company in administration. The British Empire did not collapse, it was wound down. Empires that collapse do so because they are defeated, militarily, economically, or politically. The British Empire was dismantled because the people running it did a calculation and concluded that it cost more to keep than to release. When the trade advantages disappeared, when the financial architecture shifted to New York, when the military costs exceeded the benefits, the rational thing was to leave. The last British Lend-Lease debt to America was paid off in December 2006. 61 years after the war ended, the bill from winning took longer to settle than the peace. The British Empire ended not with a battle but with a spreadsheet. The numbers changed, the policy followed. The question is not whether power can be maintained when the economics turn against it. History suggests it cannot. The question is, which powers today are being maintained by a calculation that has not yet been updated, and what happens when someone finally does the arithmetic?